Welcome, everyone, to our last panel of our 3-day spring conference called Intelligence, a unique look into China and Russia. Cyberspace has become a war zone as hackers across the world clash for digital supremacy in a new, mostly invisible theater of operations. In fact, cyber espionage incidents are becoming a key weapon for governments seeking to defend national sovereignty and project national power. Hacking and disinformation campaigns linked to Russia and China have stepped up significantly since the COVID-19 pandemic became widespread, increasing alarm over cyberspace that democratic nations can sometimes be ill-equipped to handle. Although nation states spying on each other is pretty common knowledge these days, the extent and sophistication of these insidious cyberware campaigns are still baffling. This is also the reason why I'm here today with Lieutenant Colonel Bill Hagestad. I would like to conclude my introductory speech on the similar note as Bill is usually used to start. 大家好，我叫 Marie，我不会说中文，所以用英语演讲。Please, Mr. Hagestad, our cyberspace is all yours.
谢谢您。早安，同志们，我的名字是何伟立。现在我给你一个历史对中国，也是 Russia 的 cyber warfare. Good morning and welcome, friends from across the world. This morning I will give you a introduction, as Marie has introduced, on the use of cyber warfare, the development of that, some historical examples from both Russia and from the People's Republic of China. I will weave in some stories from the field so as not to alarm you. So with that, let's go to the first slide. So we're going to talk about specifically, as I mentioned, China and Russia. Next slide, let's show the maps. You can see that both Russia and China is where we're going to go. I will tell you from my field experience, I have been a frequent guest in both of these countries. And you may ask yourself, why or how could this be? Well, as we go to the next slide, I wrote my first book in 2011. And in doing so, it basically sent a message to the countries around the world that there are intelligence individuals or those with military experience that are cataloging and defining a taxonomy. My first book was banned in China, but it is no longer banned in China, as a BBC reporter confirmed to me about 8 years ago. Next slide, please. I've written 3 more books. Next slide, please. And my most recent one last year in 2020 was on basically the strategic use of cyber weapons by the People's Republic of China. Next slide, please. Everyone has been hacked. Everyone. Please do not be the government individual that stands up in front of the whole audience and says that your country has not been hacked. Don't make that mistake. Unfortunately, that happened in a Central Eurasian country, and I felt bad for that poor fellow. Next slide, please. Any discussion on the adversaries or individuals, threat actors, as Marie referred to them in cyberspace, includes a taxonomy from cyber organizations such as Anonymous and LulzSec, all the way through criminal networks such as the Russian Business Network, as well as, indeed, nation states during peacetime and wartime. Today, we will talk about nation states during peacetime, and as Marie so eloquently put it, during wartime as well. Next slide, please. If you are in this business and have not seen the rise of Cyber Westphalia, it is important that you look this particular article up. It comes to us from the United States Air Force, but it is an important discussion because it talks about the cyber realm in 2011. Today, it's 10 years later, and the principles in this particular still apply. What it means is at that time, law enforcement was trying to figure out how to protect the borders based on World War I rules of sovereignty in a geographical zone. That is no longer the case because now I could hack your country sitting here in Middle America in as much as you could hack me from your particular country. Next slide, please. So if we go back to 2011, I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson. This Office of the National Counterintelligence Executive basically came up with a notification to the rest of the world that both China and Russia were using the cyber realm for not only cyber military operations, which will be the focus of today's talk, but also for the exfiltration of intellectual property vis-a-vis cyber espionage. What's unique about this is the 2018 version of this diminishes the impact of Russia to a criminal nation and really reflects more popularly on the People's Republic of China as the main protagonist in the cyber realm. This is very important. Next slide, please. So let's talk about those Russians. But before I talk about that, and we go to Soviet Russia first, ask yourself this: why has nobody written a book about Soviet or Russian cyber warfare? Why is that? And well, I'll tell you why. It would have been 2014. I was in Amsterdam, and I was doing a talk at a international conference, and I was setting up. And before anybody arrived, two gentlemen sat down in front of me as I was putting my presentation on the talk. And in very thick Russian accents, they said, "Bill, we know who you are. You need to watch what you talk about and who you reference in your presentations." Thus, I will tell you that perhaps a book that I've been writing is perhaps out there, and it will be under an alias or a pseudonym. So let's go on to Russia, shall we? But is it really Russia? I mean, certainly the culture exists. And let's go on to the next one. But indeed, it is the Russian Federation. Make no mistake about that. They are very proud of this culturally, historically, and linguistically, much like the second country we'll talk about. But really, as we go to the next slide, it is really Putin's Russian Federation. He has been elected almost essentially the leader for life of the Russian Federation. And certainly recent discussions in the Politburo equivalent, the Duma in Russia, have indicated that he wants to be the leader of Russia until at least 2036. Any political allies, of course, are put in prison and beaten, as we now know from history. Next slide, please. But if you recall, from information security as well as physical threats, they view information security, particularly of the Russian government, as an internal and an external matter. This is what will frame our discussion. Next slide, please. But let's go historically back to Marshal Sergeyev. In 2000, he came up with the Russian doctrine that essentially identified hostile operations that may target the military structure as external threats that must be dealt with, and the internal threats, those that could disrupt the culture, the fabric of society, and the political leadership. This is similar to China, but we'll talk about that here in a second. What is important for you to understand as a recent visitor, as a guest of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to Moscow, it was important to note that the FSB was sitting alongside some of the most famous hackers at a hacking conference. And there is your good friend Bill sitting there with them, watching this unique dialogue. They entertained these hackers as if they were celebrities. As long as these hackers do not threaten internal Russian infrastructure, they are allowed to do whatever they want. Thus, the criminality that we experience. In this presentation, I will not give you a historical rundown of what has happened. You can do that on your own reading the press. Let's go on to the next slide, shall we? Let's talk about Marshal Sergeyev in 1999. What he talks about is 4 treatises of cyber warfare. And this is what's called Revolution of Military Affairs, where cyber weapons are, of course, equated with some technological developments, including reconnaissance as well as EMP, or electronic magnetic pulse types of weapons. But more importantly, drones. Now, if you're following your history here in the United States, you'll know that a U.S. Navy ship off the coast of our southern state of California was recently attacked by a fleet of drones. I will tell you that it was the Chinese, make no mistake about it, testing our resolve. Well, the Russians are thinking about this as well. Next slide, please. As we look at the official statement of information warfare from 2012, Nikolai Makarov basically said that they, being the Russian military, must now look at cyber as a domain of warfare equivalent with the kinetic aspects of sea, land, and air. Thus, it can be used as a combined arms to fix in place their adversaries and defeat them in all space. Next slide, please. Now, it's interesting because they use the platform of Twitter to announce the Russian policy on internet use. And I think it's rather hilarious. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. They're using a Western platform to announce to the rest of the world what is the information policy of the Russian Federation. This is interesting because that basically tells you and I, as non-Russians, that they are indeed very serious about this and they must make accounts for the rest of the world. Next slide, please. Now, it's interesting if we go back to 2008 historically that there was an official announcement about information security doctrine. What's really interesting about this is it now becomes a principle of national security for the Russian Federation. Not Soviet Russia, not any Russia before that, but the current Russian state in 2008. If you think about that, it has really served as the policy formation for the Russian Federation when it comes to really adjudicating and demanding that not only internal law enforcement, but military in the Russian space use information and cyber capabilities to fix in place adversaries or criminals and defeat them. Next slide, please. And of course, we have one of the military theorists that I respect, Mr. Rostogoyev. What's interesting is he defined information warfare as a weapon to be directed specifically at an adversary and defeat that capability that the adversary is using against you. It is very similar to the Chinese in that not necessarily combining psychological operations yet, although he did talk about that. He specifically talked about making sure that if an adversary has a weapon, they, being the Russians, must up that ante and use power that will overwhelm and destroy an adversary. Next slide, please. I mentioned the information doctrine for the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation. Next slide, please. And of course, back to Nikolai Makarov in 2012, he really mentioned that Russian Federation must keep pace with developing Western countries. If you look back historically at this time in Russia, they were still trying to figure out what Russia would become. And remember, the military had dissolved with all of the Soviet breakup. It became sort of a cauterizing, galvanizing purpose for the Russian Federation and the Russian military to say that they must, as a Russian people, be ready for all wars, including space and cyber wars. And if you look historically at what the United States has been doing, they have formed a space command. I imagine that the Russians will not be too far behind. Next slide, please. Now, if we think about the integration of combining technology and warfare, you'll see that Russia is motivated essentially by three factors. One, they need to really attempt to drive outside of criminal behavior, economic diversification, meaning they need to survive in an interwoven, interdependent global economy. Number two, I believe, and I've bumped into this in my trips to Moscow, that they are still upset that they lost the Cold War. They have an unending need to recover what has long since taken place in the Soviet experience in Central Europe. And then next, of course, there's the combined necessity to control natural resources such as LNG, CNG, and oil. This is important. Next slide, please. Now, of course, how does the Russian military get back to focusing on building that capacity for cyber warfare? Well, indeed, much like they have done in China, they volunteer programmers from a Russian perspective who are very good at the university that they will indeed work for the Russian military. They will be assigned scientific research units in the Russian military in order to give that capability from a nation leading perspective in cyber and information warfare capabilities. Next slide, please. And then, as I mentioned, there are really cyber warfare capabilities unmatched across law enforcement as well. Remember, I mentioned that it is internal and external threats. It is interesting because it must be a combination of both internal law enforcement as well as the military to protect the entire Russian sphere against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This includes building a capacity that perhaps surpasses the Russian nuclear equivalent to the US nuclear football. Next slide, please. And of course, in 2013, the Russians announced that indeed they would have a separate branch of Russian military, which would be cyber warfare forces. This is very important because this was really spawned by the United States military disclosure and discussion about cyber warfare in 2009 with a DoD message. More about that later. Next slide, please. And of course, the Russian Defense Ministry came up with a special cybersecurity force that will talk about modernizing the capabilities of the Russian cyber warfare units, meaning that critical infrastructure must be protected against enemies from a Russian perspective, not only mentioning law enforcement, but primarily critical national infrastructure in Russia will be protected by the military. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we have the ERA, a Technopolis off the Black Sea, which is essentially the elite of the Russian army. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have not heard of this organization, then I request that you pay attention right now or have another sip of tea, because this is where the elite Russian military capability for information and cyber warfare, including psychological operations and directed energy weapons, and perhaps the development of the space forces will take place in the future, if it has not already. Next slide, please. Now let's take a look at some examples. Russia has written the book on the combined use of kinetic forces in cyber war. Indeed, they invaded Georgia, as we see on the screen, followed by my good friends Estonia and the NATO cyber Cyber Center of Excellence, which I've lectured at a number of times. And then, of course, next slide, please. We have our favorite country, the Ukraine. And if I'm not mistaken, here in the US, we see a large buildup of forces facing the Ukraine as we sit here speaking, if they have not already crossed the border. Next slide, please. And here you have the image of a Russian special operator, if you will. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to take you on a case study. Now, and I know Jeffrey is working on the slides. This one has a lot of animation. Jeffrey, do you see a screen of the Ukraine? Tab once, please. And now you'll see a closer up photo of Russia and the Ukraine with various IXPs on the map. Next slide, please. I'm going to start to take you on, if I were to write a book on how to invade a country, I would base it on the Russian military's use of combined cyber capabilities to essentially eliminate the communications capability of the Ukraine against adversaries in this particular case. Next one, please. Next slide, please. And it should build out to the point where you see some helicopters coming in on the right-hand side of the screen, yes? Okay, that's the end of this. Now, I want to sit on this slide for a second because if you read this case study, this was something that I presented to NATO cyber capabilities. In all humility, they had never seen anyone look at the way that you could basically defeat a country by essentially rerouting the IP traffic to make it look as if it were coming from Russian internet exchange providers. This is quite unique because at the same time, you're defacing the government websites of the country you're invading to demonstrate to the people that they are still Russian and they are no longer speaking the language to which they were originally raised with. You can imagine if you're in the military and these special operators, Spetsnaz, show up and basically say you have two choices. You can either join us after you give us your weapons, or you can die here defending needlessly a country that is no longer yours. This gives you the capability and identity of the way that the Russians have written the book essentially on how to use cyber warfare to invade a country, perhaps coming to a border near you. Next slide, please. Now let's go on to China, the country that I have found to be so fascinating in my history, certainly going back to 1983, as I gave in my opening soliloquy. Next slide, please. You should see a globe. Yes. And let's go to the next slide, please, Jeffrey. You'll see a map of the world with China in the center, yes? You see a globe with China in the middle, basically a slide with China in the middle as the map. Yes, precisely. This is the way the Chinese view every one of us. We are not Chinese, therefore we are subservient to the Chinese view of the world. Make no mistake about it, if you are not Chinese in the realm of cyber warfare, then you are worthless. You are less than human in their regard. And this is the way that the presentation will go from this point forward. Next slide, please. Now, every year in the fall, the US military, the Department of Defense, comes up with a military and security development regarding China. What's really unique about the 2020 version is it starts to talk about the strategic support force in some very granular detail, talking about their ability to conduct reconnaissance on countries, their ability to complete offensive cyber operations, computer network operations that fix and place an adversary, dismiss their ability to operate in the cyber realm and defeat them. This is really interesting because the majority target, as you might imagine, is the United States. Certainly there are other countries, but in this case, it is the protagonist, arch rival of the economic powerhouse that is the People's Republic of China that is at effect here. Next slide, please. So let's go into China, shall we? Next slide, please. Historically, some of you have perhaps gone to China. These are the ancient characters of China. I will tell you that in my experience working with the #1 think tank of the military and the People's Liberation Army, the NOFAR Institute of Jiangsu Province, I will tell you that they regard my visiting as one of curiosity because I was visiting China before some of them were even born. What that means is that I have instant credibility when it comes to the history of the China that they now know. I also have combat experience, which they do not have, and for some ungodknown reason, they desire to have that. And I tell them, be careful what you wish for, because the price that you will have to pay for that is significant enough that your nation might not be able to survive it. Next slide, please. And of course, we have Xi Jinping Of course, he has really given us some edicts about the characteristics for the new era in China, meaning that every Chinese person is a human firewall, not only internally, but as they open ports on the Great Firewall of China externally, which allow hackers to do their business as an adversarial proxy state. Next slide, please. Now, there have been 9 laws that have been introduced by China. Next slide, please. Make no mistake, the People's Republic of China is a communist country. I will never say anything that is derogatory, inflammatory, or disrespectful to China or any other country. So make no mistake, I say this with reverence as I talk about the People's Republic of China. Now, in 2017, they came up with a national cyber law. What that means is national security of the borders of China is equivalent, if violated, to that of terrorism. Everyone remembers 9/11 here in the United States. Well, they essentially say that if you use Western technology without approval or risk assessment or penetration testing, it is the equivalent of being a terrorist. What they're telling the world is no longer will they allow any foreigners that are not Chinese to come into China and use technology of their choice because they believe that it has backdoors. Next slide, please. So let's enter the binary revolution and our good historical friend Mao Zedong. Next slide. And basically the message that I want you to leave with on this portion is you must respect the sovereignty of China. Go back to the Boxer Rebellion when a number of Western nations, including Japan, not that they're a Western nation, actually occupied physically the soil of China. The Chinese never forgot that, and they said no one will ever have that ability to do that again from a physical perspective or from a cyber perspective. Next slide, please. So let's look at China. And you see a map of the fragmented provinces, yes? Let's go on to 1949 and information warfare. Mao Zedong, using Japanese insurgents, basically told his field commanders as they pushed General Chiang Kai-shek off to Taiwan that I want you to create confusion in the minds of our adversary, fix them in place, and destroy them so that they are no longer an adversary of the modern China. These are powerful words coming from the founding father of communist China. Next slide, please. And of course, in 2010, under presidential order from then President Hu Jintao, you basically have an order coming down that says you, as the military leaders of China, will create a defensive network which will protect China against the enemies and nation states that will come after us. If you could build out the slide, Jeffrey, please, you'll see a yellow square that has Han Chinese at the top of it. What is unique about this is Hu Jintao picked the most brilliant minds of his military. And he knew that if there was ever a question at the end of the day as to whether his generals were going to do the right thing to support China, he knew that they were Han Chinese. That means pure Han. They're not Uyghurs. They're not Americans. They're not Czechs. They're not British. They are pure Han Chinese. He knew that there would be no mistake that they would follow his orders. He also knew that they were card-carrying communist members. They were also technologists in their own right, leaders in the military, and above all, at the end of the day, he knew that they were Zhongguo Renmin, basically Chinese people. Next slide, please. Now, if we go back, we know that there are certainly the Chinese view. And if you look at the kinetic shape of that bomb on the cover of this magazine, next slide, please. A number of stories were written by academics, by civilian men and women, military, as well as the average person inside China. And what they talked about is that China could not be ever taken advantage of by a country such as the United States in the cyber realm. And basically they signaled to the rest of the world that China would start to prepare for war against the protagonist, which is China. You know, historically, I referenced the 2009 notice by the US military that they were going to create a cyber command. Think back historically, Russia, China, and North Korea and Iran all announced within a year of that announcement that they would create their own cyber commands. So think about that. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the hackers, Hacker. But first, let's talk about Zhongguo Shushe. Who is China? Well, China remains very much a communist country. You've got the Politburo, you've got the military, and you've got the state. I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, in my various taxi trips or rides with the Chinese military, they know beyond a shadow of a doubt that while they are culturally, linguistically, historically, and economically Chinese, they are communists. They are run by communists. You will know historically that whenever there has been regime change in China, it is only when the people rise up and decide that indeed they are tired with the current regime. This is the delicate balance that the Communist Party and the military must ensure cannot happen in order to retain their seat of power. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the four unofficial groups, and I'll introduce you to each one of these. You've got the Communist Party, the CPC, my good friends, the Jundui, the PLA. You've got state-owned enterprises such as Huawei, and then you've got hackers or Heike. Heike is transliteration for dark guest or hacker. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned that the threat of regime change is always evident and certainly on the forefront of all the boys and girls who rule from Beijing, but they want you to know that indeed the civilian dimension of the internet, economic as it might be, is really a focus for the military to use, and it is controlled by the Ministry of State Security, specifically the Golden Shield or the Golden Firewall. What's unique, and you should ask yourself, if hackers are able to jump that firewall, how could this be unless only they are authorized? And I will introduce you to some face-to-face here in a minute, so stand by. Next slide, please. Now, the Communist Party, as I mentioned, that first group, really started this cyber journey with from a civilian political perspective with Hu Jintao in 2010. These edicts have been reinforced, accelerated by the current president, Xi Jinping. Make no mistake, he is the leader for life in China, self-elected as it may be, and he will continue to maintain that Chinese dream for all Chinese to really begin and retain that position as the center of the world. Remember that map that I showed you. Next slide, please. Now, what is really unique about this, you should see a Chinese policeman with a shield on it. Yes, Jeffrey? Very good. This should really send the shivers down the businessmen and women in the audience, because this tells you that the Chinese police can station a cyber operator on the network of your company inside China, conduct penetration tests, conduct remote control examinations of your network, your hardware, your software, your firmware at any time. They can look for vulnerabilities that may impact the Chinese cyberspace. Without getting too technical, they basically own you. And while the People's Armed Police, the PAPC runs this, it's interesting that they can conduct on-site unannounced inspections. If you personally or your company fall afoul of this, you can be arrested for cyber espionage, espionage in general, and terrorism, and arrested and basically confined until found not guilty. Exciting stuff. Next slide, please. Let's go to our friends in the military, shall we? Now, next slide, please. You should see at the top it says PLA, yes? Jeffrey? Fantastic. Thank you, sir. Any discussion about China and cyber warfare without mentioning Sun Tzu is irrelevant. It is naive and should not be taken seriously. Sun Tzu wrote the book, The Art of War. I will tell you that in my discussions with the PLA, they still regard it as their guide for the way that they conduct kinetic and now cyber warfare. If you like the book Art of War, his great-grandson Sun Ping wrote Military Methods, which is actually a better book than The Art of War. And then, of course, we fast forward to General Wang Pufeng in 1995. Some consider him to be the information warfare founding father of China. And then, of course, in 1999, 4 years later, we have War Without Limits, War Without Smoke, or Unrestricted Warfare, written by then Senior Colonel Qiao Liang and Wang Xiaosui. And then a few years later, we have Major General Dai Qingming introducing us to Integrated Network Electronic Warfare. Next slide, please. Now, if you know your history with regard to China or any other nation state when it comes to cyber warfare, you will note that they, being the Chinese military, were not announcing to the rest of the world that they had created a cyber command. On the screen in front of you, you will see a Chinese Ministry of Defense statement that basically says they have established officially a cyber command. But you'll notice in the lower right-hand corner, it says, oops, this page is currently unavailable. This, along with many other parts of my research, have been redacted, removed, and otherwise erased from the Chinese internet. This tells you, folks, that they are watching what we are watching and are very careful now of how they announce things. Next slide, please. Now, I had the great fortune, as embarrassing and humbling as it was, to meet the authors of Unrestricted Warfare. Senior Colonel Wang Xiaosui, to my right, left in this photo, is getting old and probably going to be sick and infirmed. To my left, 3-star General Qiao Liang, He is now certainly a senior general officer in the People's Liberation Army Air Force. 10 minutes. Thank you, Marie. Appreciate that. I'll speed it up. We're almost done. You can imagine being invited to a Chinese military conference where I was sat down between these two gentlemen. You can imagine that this photo and this opportunity for anyone else will never take place again. I guarantee you that. Next slide, please. And of course, they teach their young cadre in the Chinese military to really create conditions for basically causing a nation state to evaporate under their conditions of information. Next slide, please. This is the Chinese equivalent of the NSA, the National Security Agency, or GCHQ as they call it in London. This was something I came across totally by happenstance. The URL at the bottom is a Chinese military URL. You can see it says China's GSD 3rd Department at the top. This has been removed from the internet. But these, ladies and gentlemen, are the leaders of the National Security Agency equivalent, Zhongshanbu, in the Chinese military. Next slide, please. In 2020, we have, of course, that the Chinese military will be using the information age as a combat environment to close with, destroy the enemy of their choosing at their time and place. Next slide, please. In 2021, of course, we have the discussion of intimidation operations. The Chinese military is now going offensively on the military bend towards destroying any enemies through defending, connecting, creating competition, and owning the future of any sort of military battle space. I would ask if your previous panel had introduced you to this concept or not. Perhaps not. Do they speak Chinese? I wonder, Jeffrey. Next slide, please. And then, of course, Xi Jinping with the civil military fusion operations under the 13th five-year plan has really came up with creating an environment where the military and the civilian world will use technology together to create military weapons on the cyber realm that can cause harm to any adversary that they choose at any particular time. Now, mind you, for this presentation, given the constraints on time, I am skipping over 10 years of military developments in the cyber realm. So for that, you'll have to engage me for another day. Next one are the state-owned enterprises, Jeffrey. Next slide. These will include companies such as Huawei, ZTE, Lenovo, etc. I'd like you to skip down to slide 70, please, which is Project 8, China's 863 plan. When you think of China, think of cyber espionage and exfiltration of data. There are a variety of companies that have been subject to this all across the world, including the Czech Republic, the United States, England, you name it. You have borne the brunt of this. If we go down to the next slide, please. These are active espionage targets, ladies and gentlemen. The Chinese have been given these. I won't talk about the 1,000 Talents plan because we do not have enough time, and I apologize for that. But these are active collection targets that the Chinese military and the Ministry of State Security are sending individuals around the country, around the world, to go after. Next slide, please. Here's a list of at least 15 intellectual property cases. Let's skip this because this is perhaps less important than what is on the next slide, Jeffrey. Here you have two Ministry of State Security hackers that are going after international companies that are developing the COVID vaccine protocol. Now, China wants to be that #1 nation. They call it vaccination diplomacy. And so they have sent their most prolific hackers after some of these countries, including Australia, Belgium, Germany, Japan, Lithuania, the Netherlands, et cetera, trying to find that vaccine that is most effective so that China can be the one that solves the problem regarding the situation or the pandemic. Next slide, please. You've got Huawei. I won't go into detail other than to say through the next slide, please, you have Nortel, which was a Canadian company that walked into a joint venture and found their innovations being essentially deployed to markets that they had not otherwise been introduced to. And they ceased to become a Canadian company and were delisted from the Canadian Stock Exchange. Next slide, please. This, ladies and gentlemen, is your money slide. This is called IDU-IB, the One Belt, One Road. This is a maritime silk initiative that mirrors Marco Polo's journey from Italy to China at the beginning of the century. Essentially, what you have here, the 18th century, in this particular case, China is building essentially maritime ports where their state-owned enterprises can basically run the ports at the disadvantage of the local government and then carry goods and services all the way with an explicit intent of colonizing the United Kingdom. Make no mistake, in my journeys and work experience, I've seen these operations up close and personal in Djibouti, throughout the Arabian Gulf, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc. You mention One Belt, One Road to these nation states, and they shudder. Now, next slide, please. Why is this important from a military perspective? Because you can see here that the Chinese military has stationed cyber centers of excellence, cyber troops in each one of these ports to protect the state-owned enterprises that are transiting these waterways. That means, ladies and gentlemen, that they have forward deployed their military to foreign countries. Is anybody even paying attention out there, I wonder? Nonetheless. Next slide, please. Last group, Marie, I tried to be on time, apologize, are the dark guests. These are the hackers. These folks are the unofficial proxy for the Chinese government. They can hack anybody at will to face a website. And if you had done the nation of country some disservice during World War II, such as Japan did, then they will hack you mercilessly. Next slide, please. And build it all the way out, please, Jeffrey. These are the modern face of China's hackers. You've got Tomb Keeper Yang Yu, who works for Microsoft and does bug bounty hunting to a six-figure income every year. You've got Claude Xiao, a dour-looking man, but very sensitive on Twitter. And then you have Eagle Wan, or Wan Tao, who is the most prolific hacker of the Chinese nation state. Now, you'll notice that I'm in the middle of that, holding one of my books. The two gentlemen on my right, on your left in the slide, carried on a conversation in Mandarin saying, so this is the guy that wrote that book. And I say, hey, guys, I can hear what you're saying. Yes, I wrote the book. Do you have any questions? And they ignored me and they said, this book was banned, but we bought several copies and we're using it as a guide. Wan Tao looked at them and said, well, you guys never gave me a copy. And they looked at him very seriously and said, you know why? You work for IBM. You are no longer Chinese. Next slide, please. In summary, I hope I'm hitting rounds on target, Marie. Basically, the Chinese are the most effective. They equate national security with cyber sovereignty. They theorized information warfare as soon as 1985, created a cyber command equivalent in 2010 in response to those darn Americans militarizing cyber warfare. They do use Mandarin Chinese to both attack and defend. Thus, they can sit on an individual's network for years without being discovered. And how many of you understood my opening soliloquy? Respectfully, probably not too many, and I apologize for that, but that's how they attack. They are motivated by that Chinese dream, that nationalistic desire to conquer the rest of the world and regain power. And of course, their purpose is intellectual property theft. I will tell you, latent develops tell me, though, that they are attacking critical national infrastructure and storming or swarming Navy vessels off the coast of California in anticipation of attempting to perhaps invade the United States. And of course, they have banned Western technology, equating that with anti-terrorism laws. They view the US as a terrorist if it does not follow their national security laws. Number 8, they know that the Chinese military is very effective at intellectual property theft through their hacking capabilities, vis-a-vis the COVID example that I gave you in those 16 areas, countries, examples, commercial examples. And then last but not least, that One Belt, One Road that I teased you with really lets you know that Chinese hacking is only going to increase globally. Their end state is that until there is a Chinese soldier stationed within every country on the planet, they will not have succeeded until that takes place. That concludes my presentation. Do I have any questions?
Of course you have, Bill.
Outstanding, Marie.
Thank you very much for such an informative presentation. I'm sure that it will resonate in our audience a while after. I really enjoy especially your phrase, nuclear football, Russian nuclear football. I will use it after for sure. And yeah, I have a first question for you. As we may know, the novel coronavirus pandemic has been a boom for hackers, aka dark guests, seeking profit in the middle of chaos. Vaccine competition and China, as you already said, want a safe word. So my question is in connection of NATO. How can NATO better equip its cybersecurity from a geopolitical angle, and how, in general, how NATO can more strengthen its cybersecurity from point of dark guests?
Yes, well, actually, NATO has an exceptional capability with a Cyber Center of Excellence in Tallinn, Estonia. I've spoken there a number of times as a guest lecturer. The challenge for NATO is that there are too many targets. There are so many countries that it really comes down to what is the priority of defense for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization leadership. If you think about it from a coronavirus perspective, woes in the EU aside and vaccine distribution, like you and I discussed earlier, aside, it really is what is the national critical infrastructure protection plan for each one of those countries? I mentioned that the Chinese are testing, probing, and looking for a way to dismantle that. I think the vaccine violation and research in some of the countries I mentioned is a feint. And the way that NATO can essentially protect itself more specifically from a military perspective, if I were in charge for a day, is identify a target list. Tell me who you're going to protect first. Is it the most vulnerable countries? Absolutely. Doesn't need to be the priority being the biggest. It should be the ones that need the help the most. Think of Article 50 of the NATO treatise. Think about that for a second. And then work your way up that target list. And then think about an offensive plan where you go after those hackers and defeat them in their space. Because if you do not, and you're part of NATO and you're under my watch, you're going to start to learn Mandarin Chinese as effectively as I do.
Thank you very much for your answer, Bill. I would like to encourage our audience to ask other questions in Slido. But I will keep going. And I have another question. Is a white-hat hacker, if I may disclose this information as well, what are the most recent trends of Chinese hackers and how NATO can more protect itself from the point of these recent trends?
Yes, this is a complex question. I think let me answer the first part and then I'll answer the second part. I think I answered that in the first question. Some of the current trends is that many of the hacking tools that are being used and have been used, I wrote about these in one of my books, are being shared across the hacking world within China. What that means is even in a pandemic situation, while they can't go to conferences and share these with other nations like Russia, as I've observed, or other countries such as Malaysia or Indonesia, they're sharing these so that they become effective. What's unique, though, is that they are wrapping in some of these rootkits Mandarin Chinese. Now, what's really unique from a NATO military perspective is you're going to buy technology lowest bid. That's the way it works. Unfortunately, low bid doesn't work in this case because if it's anomaly-based, behavior-based, or signature-based, those solutions for detecting malware are going to be worthless against Mandarin. Because number one, you don't speak it. Number two, you don't understand the semantics. And number three, you don't know what they're coming after. You might as well give up and put me in charge.
Thank you, Bill. And when you elaborated recent hacks, what did it change somehow during the pandemic? Because as we know, the digital transformation and security kind of changed. The paradigm of the world where we are living now changed. So did it also change from the point of hackers? Because as we may know, over 90% of organizations had to stop or delay digital transformation because of data's breach and privacy and these kind of things. So how it changed?
Oh my gosh. Think from your personal perspective, from my personal perspective, and indeed in the US, a study came out that said that Department of Defense workers are actually 30 to 40% more effective working from home. Think about that from a hacker perspective. No longer do you need to worry about going anywhere to share these vulnerabilities, these zero-day exploits. You can click a button, open a chat window securely, and share those instantaneously. What that means is they are becoming more effective. They're looking for those soft targets. They're looking, as I mentioned in the prioritization of NATO targeting, they're looking for countries that are not readily protected. So what that means is hackers are now starting to look at all things possible for them to essentially violate with vulnerabilities and own them. This means that our resolve as a nation state, as an organization such as NATO, must be stronger than ever. We must have the most capable men and women on the front lines to defend our networks, not just the military networks, but the national infrastructure. Because if we do not, they will sit inside those until they decide to pull the trigger and bring it down.
Thank you, Bill. And we have the first question from our audience.
All right.
From Edher, I hope that I pronounce the name correctly. Are Russia and China looking into different financial institutions to further develop their cyber hacking capabilities?
Oh my goodness, yes. Oh, well, we must tie in the country of the Islamic Republic of Iran first. If you think of the sanctions against the Iranians and all that money after the clerics took power in 1989 with the Russian capture of the U.S. embassy, all of the resources sat in the SWIFT system in London, which is the financial capital of the world. Make no mistake about it. China has developed their own, as has Russia, their own system for basically intertranslating or transferring money. And what they're allowing the Iranians to do is to use those systems equivalent to SWIFT to transfer the monies. I've done talks on the Chinese banking system. They do no longer use Western servers that are potentially vulnerable. And the Russians, of course, are going to use anything that comes in to their country as an external threat. They're going to basically destroy it. What that means from a financial perspective is the Chinese have developed the Asian Development Bank as an example for a means of shoring up countries that cannot help themselves. And in shoring them up, much like the One Belt, One Road, they ask for a bond position within that, which means economically they have the power when it comes to making decisions. So make no mistake, it's brilliant if you think about it. They're not just there to help you, they're there to own you.
That's really true, and it's brilliant. And another question: why do NATO allies not retaliate against China when China has hacked hospitals in Germany, etc.? Is there a problem in attribution?
Oh my gosh, yes, yes. I did not include the slides of Hack Back. I would recommend against that because not anything good can come from this. Certainly, the hospital situation that you're talking about, I would not equate that with any sort of Chinese hacking. That is not their style. It's not even the Russian style because they know that that could easily happen to their population. I think in this particular case, it was misconfigured servers. That story aside, I think that the concept of attribution is an illusion. You may get there very close on classified capabilities, but for mere civilians like you and I, Marie, and the gentleman or lady asking the question, we merely have to wait until it comes out in the newspapers to read about it, unfortunately.
Thank you. Another question: what is your opinion on Bitcoin? Do China and Russia use them cyber related?
Yes. Some of you may know if you follow me that I do run a LinkedIn group called Chinese Bitcoin. There are some very interesting individuals, not only from the People's Republic of China and throughout Asia, but also from Russia that are discussing a variety of different alternatives to the Western version of Bitcoin, specifically using that as a digital transference to supersede any sort of US attempts to look at the transfer of money for terrorist purposes. Yes, I'd be very concerned if I were in law enforcement right now.
Thank you. And I would like to ask you about what is your kind of not vision about how hackers where hacking is leading, or what is your like perspective on the future of in terms of cyber hacks and these kind of things?
Yes, I think it almost merits a longer discussion that we may not have time for, but I think it depends on the country that you're talking about. If we talk about Russia, for example, they will continue to refine the playbook that they have written regarding creating conditions of defeat within an adversarial country. Vis-a-vis, they want to bring back the old Soviet bloc in the true shadow of the current Russian Federation. That is where I see it going, and they will use hackers to make this happen. And they will use it combined with kinetic ground forces, as I mentioned in my case study, with the overlay of the different technological advances there. With regard to China, this is a little bit more concerning because if they are not making economic progress, and certainly the pandemic has slowed them down, they will use the hacking ability to violate any network anywhere on the planet in order to create conditions where they are the leadership within a country economically, not necessarily politically, but economically, and eventually militarily, as I've described with the One Belt, One Road. Look at South America, for example. There are a variety of countries that are now beholding to the Chinese for the economic position and growth that they have so adroitly developed. But make no mistake, the Chinese hackers are there to support that strategic development of the Chinese Communist government.
Thank you, Bill. Operation Socialist. I guess it's someone who call himself Operation Socialist. How can EU countries build trust when these sort of operations are conducted against each other? So no, it's
Understood. Yeah, I understand the question. Yes, this is perhaps the dilemma. I think, um, politically, when you have leadership that transitions rather regularly, certainly the intent from a political perspective percolates down to the member states of the EU. That's not an indictment; it's just fact. I think that's why NATO should have a much more prominent position in helping to defend and really identify some of those countries that will come after it. Thus, my target priority list that you had asked for. I would look at protecting that infrastructure so to support the revolving wheel of leadership in the EU. Leaders will come and go from a political perspective, but the military has a mission, not only from a national perspective in each one of those countries, but from a combined effort regarding NATO. Work together, you're much stronger.
Do you think another frontier in the future? Will there be like another level of, for example, to artificial intelligence and some kind of another frontier?
Yes, the Chinese are already there militarily. I mentioned the catalog and review of the 10 years that I've been tracking their military developments. They're already using quantum cryptography, artificial intelligence, and certainly the ability to look at a nation state from dark wars. They've got a database country that's listening right now.
How can we mitigate dark web? From the point that there is on the Tor's darknet, there is a lot going on. How states can kind of mitigate what is going on there?
Well, yeah, the dark web, unfortunately, is a place of naughtiness. A lot of bad things happen there. I think the pure cultural view of the Chinese, the pure cultural view of Russia, certainly the anti-criminality perspective of the United States and many nation states. I think if we were to work together to identify individuals that would take advantage of sex trafficking, drugs, things like that, I think we could come together on a common purpose and actually make the world stronger rather than weaker.
Stronger we are together.
Yes.
Another question: how vulnerable are space-based assets? Is there a danger?
Oh my gosh, yes. Don't even get me started. Yes, this is the stuff of science fiction, but you have to understand that when the United States makes a military command out of it, you know that it's going to get quite serious. I don't imagine that there will be space marines invading asteroids anytime soon, but I think the advanced technology that drives that initiative from a military perspective will take front seat. But remember, all that technology is connected. It's also subject to being hacked. So, in terms of answering an earlier question of what is the next frontier, imagine taking advantage of a direct laser weapon that can wipe out an entire infrastructure from space and directing it at a country of one's own design. Something like out of a James Bond movie, isn't it?
That's a really nice synonym to what you just said. Should nations go back to old technologies, analog, to avoid cyber attacks, basically ensure they can function during cyber attacks?
Oh my gosh. Well, certainly backups and the experience of individuals that are maybe not cyber smart, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, have the leadership both from a non-commissioned, staff non-commissioned, and leadership perspective exists within militaries. They should really be teaching the younger soldiers, both men and women, how to fight in an environment that is not connected. Ultimately, it's going to come down to putting a round of ammunition in a weapon and firing it. So yes, they should have backup plans that include the combined arms of defeating a cyber capability of a nation state, but also using the resolve and training of working with other nations that have been at war in order to perfect their martial skills. As unsavory as that is, the EU and the European continent has experienced that a couple times in this lifetime. Hopefully, they will never have to face that again.
Does somehow, and if the new Biden administration affect Whitehead work and how the hackers are proceeding. What is there any how it can affect your work and or the like a function of how United States is trying to prevent the hacking?
Yes, this is quite a lengthy answer, so forgive me. I think the most important thing that has taken place in the United States outside of the current administration or previous administrations is the impact of information sharing organizations. As you know, in the United States, we have 16 areas of critical infrastructure, everything from monuments to banks to roads to whatever it might be, transportation. What is taking place is those communities are sharing information about vulnerabilities in order to protect the members, the civilian companies, against the enemies. The military in the United States will not protect the critical infrastructure. That is a misnomer that sometimes is bandied about incorrectly. What that means is, for an effective way for to use white hat hackers is to help them identify vulnerabilities early through research in order to plus up these information sharing communities. I think the same thing and initiative could be widely leveraged in the EU successfully. Certainly, each one of the countries, I know the Dutch have a fantastic CERT, Computer Emergency Response Team. Other countries have them as well. If they start to work together, identify these vulnerabilities, give them to law enforcement, bring to justice these individuals that would want to do harm to companies and infrastructure, then I think they will be following a very effective model. It is not difficult, but it is not easy at the same time.
Thank you, Bill. And my last question, when you were speaking about Cyber Command of 2009 and then in 2010 other nations were following, my question is regarding NATO and its Cyber Command. Is it enough, and how would you improve it in a way to kind of prevent?
Yes. So, as I mentioned in 2009, the U.S. said we're going to create a cyber command. That doesn't mean they componentized it. That happened not too long ago, a few years ago, where they actually militarized it, meaning there are hackers operating out of the National Security Agency, for example. The way that NATO could improve is really continue the course of education that they are now using out at the facility in Tallinn, Estonia. That is a fantastic facility run by multinational military operators all the way up and down the chain of command. It is a fantastic organization. If your audience has not visited or requested a conversation with them, I highly suggest that. In my visits there, I was very impressed with the level of technical knowledge that was being developed, so much so that they have a variety of exercises that works on protecting the infrastructure. And these are not boys and girls in uniform. These are some of the brightest minds of the hacking community working together from a nationalistic perspective. And if you think of the way that the Chinese are the most effective, they use their nationalistic hackers to their benefit as well. So you're starting to see a force majeure taking place within NATO already.
Thank you very much, Bill. Do you have any comments that you would like to add to our presentation today?
I'm honored and humbled, and I graciously thank you so much. Marie, you've been a fantastic moderator. Obviously, you could tell from my enthusiasm that I could go on for 8 hours about this subject. It's fascinating, and I look forward to the next opportunity. And thank you very much, Marie.
Yeah, I totally see that it's your passion and everything. And I would like to thank you on behalf of Atlantic Forum and also to our audience that they had so many questions too. And I hope that it also satisfied your procedure that you always ask for more questions. So thank you so much. And now I would like to give a voice to John, who will follow with closing remarks of our conference. So thank you very much.